I really appreciate you listening to the podcast here. Let's go get started. It's Saturday, and it's time to keep our civics lessons going and dig into the vice presidency. I'm feeling a little sassy today because I worked out in my yard. I'm trying to save a pumpkin plant that the gophers got, and I have such the best pumpkins on there. They're outstanding, and I want them to stay. So I'm a little sassy. And as I dug into the vice presidential information, because again, like I said, we're trying to do this like a civics class, I wanted to bring up things that you may or may not know, may or may not remember, or actually are kind of curious about and want to learn more about. So that's what the goal is today. 2 days of talking about the vice presidency, the job that everybody doesn't really know what it is and knows that they're just the second person in command. But the deal is the vice presidency is so important. And as I start to talk about the roles and responsibilities, what's really important, the most important thing is they need to have some experience. They need to understand how government works, which is really different than business. And my story that I always tell that helped me really understand the difference between business and government is because a lot of nonprofits run like government. Government's a good healthy dose of command and control, and it's also a healthy dose of trying to all agree on things, which is terrible. It's just exhausting, but it's important because you want to have all the voices heard, but sometimes it's just really difficult, and I have a hard time with it because I am the kind of person who always thinks that she knows the right thing to do, and so just get out of my way. I got to go get it done. But I have absolutely tuned in my listening skills because it is important to hear everybody's voice at the table. But when you need to get stuff done, it's tough. And so here we are in working in a government where we want experience. We want people that know that present well. I mean, I always laugh when I see people go, I just don't like them. And I'm thinking that's so not relevant. Not liking someone is just not how you choose a president or a vice president. And what you want to look for is a skill base, and a skill base that can translate to government work, which is very different than corporate work, than business. And it requires a different skill set. It requires listening skills. It requires negotiating. It requires super thick skin. It requires your ability to keep your eye on the ball and not get caught up in all the noise that can happen. You've got to stay focused. So there are skills that you need to be a vice president. In fact, maybe I should drop a dream job description for vice president because I don't really know if anybody's ever really made the right job description. And what I'll share with you in just a second is that this job has really changed over the centuries, which is kind of cool to say. America can say something's changed over the centuries, but it has. And the role of vice president has become much more exciting, interesting, relevant, and incidental in that they can do things of consequence now that probably they didn't used to do, just because of how the world has changed. So if we come and look at this idea of the vice president, it's the person who is always a heartbeat away from the top, right? That's how we all think of it. They're the person that has to swap in if the president even goes down for something simple but they're unconscious and they're not able to make decisions. A vice president has to be ready to step in. So of course, there's been some bumps in the roads, but let's dig in. So the first thing that a VP really does is presides over the Senate. So remember, we talked about the executive branch and the legislative branch. Well, this is where you see the executive branch come over and preside over the Senate. And you've seen Kamala Harris do this. You have seen Mike Pence do this. Joe Biden did it for almost a decade. During the Obama years. So you've seen them do this. That's usually at the House. It's there at the Senate. It's in the Senate chamber, and they're there typically when Senate is deadlocked. So they're there to break the ties when the Senate is deadlocked, and they're the ultimate tiebreaker. And so this is really important when you have a House or a Senate that is right at the edge of being tied, which is what we have right now. We're very close to being tied. So because of this, the way this vice presidency as the tiebreaker has worked is it started in 1789. So just a little bit after we got our the Constitution, everything together. And the VP has decided how the vote will go in history 301 times. So since 1789, the vice president has had a deciding vote 301 times. Kamala Harris, for instance, in this currently now, she's done it 33 times so far, mostly for judges and budget reconciliation acts. I have a link to what those votes are in the companion blog, and you'll see most of them were for judges. I mean, almost all of them were for judges. And then some of the House resolutions to get the budget, when we have to keep doing these stupid stopgap budget measures because we can't seem to do it the right way. So that's what Kamala Harris has done 33 times. Mike Pence did it 13 times, most often for House resolutions, which makes sense. It was tight in the House in the second half of the Trump presidency, and Mike Pence had to go in there and help break things up 13 times. Break up this tie. And then this blew my mind. Joe Biden, who was vice president between 2009 and 2017, he never once had a tie-breaking vote. He didn't have to go break a tie ever. So that's when I believe that the Senate was Mitch McConnell's, the House was Nancy Pelosi's, and so it was not ever close enough where a tie would need to be broken. And back in those days, 2009, 2017, if you all recall. So if you look at some of the tie-breaking votes and how important the role of the vice president is when it comes to it, John Adams, who was the very first vice president, had 29 tie-breaking votes. And one was for a controversial law that later contributed to the Alien and Seditions Acts, laws that were highly debated and divisive at the time. And so that you can see that they can come in and make a huge difference if there's something that's really right on the edge. Kamala Harris used her tie-breaking power to confirm judges, which of course we all know now shapes our judiciary for decades to come. And then of course I'm sorry, I thought I had one more. And so these laws, they're really important because they can change the fabric of our nation, right? So if your VP, you need to know how they're going to come down on the things that you care about. So there are good VPs and there are bad VPs. We have a VP instance right now where Mike Pence, who certifies the votes for an election, he understood his role. He could not change that certification just because he wanted to. He did certify the election in 2020, right? 2020, because it's 2024, yeah. In 2020. But this year, if J.D. Vance is elected with Trump into office, J.D. Vance has said he would postpone certifying the vote. So a VP does have power, and how they choose to use their power is an important consideration when you're considering your ticket. And the ticket is both the headliner, meaning the presidential candidate, and then the vice president. That is who's on your party's ticket. It's the same as ballot. It's just the language you might hear as the ticket. Since the VP is also in the first line of succession, of course, if the president goes down, the VP steps in. And there's an example that's pretty dramatic was when Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Again, Gerald Ford took office after Richard Nixon's resignation. If you think of those two people, both Gerald Ford and Lyndon Johnson, they didn't expect to be president. I mean, they might have dreamt about it at night and had fantasies and everything, but it hits pretty hard when it lands on your plate and you have to step up and you need to know what you're doing. So Lyndon Johnson and Gerald Ford both have their own reputations. And interestingly enough, even Harry Truman became president after Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in 1945. And of course, Harry Truman turned out to be one of the best presidents we'd ever had in terms of his ability to do things on behalf of the American people. So critical moments in history, really, again, a very, very American thing. And we take it so for granted, but these are actually non-war related peaceful transitions of power. It's not like what's happening in Venezuela. It's not like what happens in other countries. We actually just look up and go, oh yeah, we have a rule for that. And we follow the rule and the next thing happens. It's freaking amazing if you think about how big our country is, how much of an economic power it is, how much of a military power it is, how much we win in terms of just our brute strength, and that we still can manage a peaceful transition of power. And it happened again when Joe Biden declared a few weeks ago he decided not to rerun. Like that was a peaceful transition of power. And we just take it for granted. But you guys, it's dramatic and it's powerful. So over the years, the world has changed. We have watched this. Let me explain. There's a story I'm going to tell you in a minute. But early VPs like John Adams really felt like the job was beneath them. They just said he actually said this is the most insignificant office that ever was invented. Something man should not have contrived. But it's changed a lot, and vice presidents have played crucial roles as advisors on certain things for presidents. For example, Joe Biden was the advisor on foreign policy. We just watched Kamala Harris was the advisor on this prisoner exchange. Dick Cheney was an advisor on national defense and national security, especially as after the 9/11 attacks. Al Gore, who took on the presidency, was all about environmental issues, and he made changes that involved looking at climate change and technological innovation. In fact, Al Gore has a soft spot in my heart because the joke is that Al Gore said he invented the internet. But honestly, what he was, because I happen to know a member of the Sun team that was doing the school rewiring that happened, or school wiring actually, school networking, happened under the Clinton and Gore administration. It was the Bush-Gore election. It was the Clinton-Gore administration. They wanted to wire the schools for internet. And my friend, Lisa Smith, and her husband, now husband, wasn't husband at the time, they were part of the team. They were hanging out with Clinton and Gore while they were pulling wires through schools. It was one of the best things, but it was a Gore priority to bring technology to the masses, to education, to people, to make it not based on socioeconomic access, but instead everybody should have access to tech. So vice presidents can have pet projects and be advisors on things that require shepherding and growth. So, but we do have a vice president that also has some controversy. And tomorrow we'll talk about controversy because I think it's kind of fun to look at where things have gone wrong. But let me tell you a little bit more about this John Adams as vice president, because he was a crotchety. He was a cranky man. He was a cranky man. So here's a story that's about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And it's way in the past. And it was before some laws changed. And this is how we're talking a lot now, today, in current day, about how our democracy is an organic living thing. And we need to take care of it, the care and feeding. We need to pay attention to it. And so this is just a really good example of how even then at the beginning, they were trying to figure out how this political system and how things were going to work. So here's the story. In the election of 1796, so this is, a long time ago, still early in the elections, John Adams was a Federalist. This was the party at the time, a Federalist, and he ran for president. Thomas Jefferson was the leader of the Democratic Republican Party. Those were the two parties, the Federalist, and yes, they were called the same, the Democrat Republican Party. The electoral system didn't distinguish between votes for president and vice president. So this is crazy. This is one of those just vote for the party and we'll figure out who's going to be the winner. We'll figure out who's going to be the president. So you didn't distinguish votes for president and vice president. Electors cast two votes, and the candidate with the most votes became president, and the runner-up became vice president. So despite being from different political parties and fundamentally disagreeing on key issues, Adams, a Federalist, became president, and Jefferson became his vice president. Now, I can see why Jefferson might be a little pissy, because here his competitor is his boss and he's vice president. So it's a tense White House. You have two different parties in the White House, both serving, and yet they are not aligned. A Federalist who favored strong central government. So at that time, Federalists were about a strong central government, and the Democratic Republicans, who were the states' rights people and a more decentralized government. So you can see where this is going. The Federalists become eventually the Democratic Party we know of today, which really relies on a strong central government for regulations, controls, and just kind of creating a baseline. And the Republicans used to believe in in less government and states' rights. Unfortunately, that's kind of not what's happening right now, which is another whole discussion for another day. But let's just imagine right now inside the White House, there are diametrically opposed forces about how to govern. One wants government, one wants states' rights. It's crazy. So in the election of 1800, 4 years later, Jefferson decided to run against Adams, his own president, in what became one of the most contentious elections in U.S. history. Jefferson won, and the peaceful transfer of power between these two men marked a significant moment in the young nation's democracy, because you had a big old hairy election and people were arguing and confused and it was brutal. But they managed to figure it out and once again do our peaceful transfer of power. The problems, though, of having a president and vice president from different parties became really clear, and the situation directly contributed to the passage of the 12th Amendment 4 years later. So just 4 years later, they managed to get this figured out. Ahem, American government, it didn't take them a bazillion years to pass the Voting Rights Act. Why can't we got this 12th Amendment ratified in 4 years? I know, fewer people, I get it. And the 12th Amendment changed the electoral process to ensure that electors cast separate votes for president and vice president. This amendment essentially ensured the president and vice president would be from the same political party, avoiding the kind of discord. So I think that ensured the electors were casting the votes based on party, not on personality, which could be, I just can't imagine having your opponent as your vice president. That's just nuts. So anyway, the 12th Amendment patched this all up. So as we get into where we're going to head tomorrow a little bit as we run this up, I have just some fun facts about vice presidents. And let's see. First of all, it was Thomas Jefferson, our third president, was also the second vice president. See, that's kind of cool. So he didn't love the job of the second vice president. I just told you why. Because his boss was his opponent. Vice President Garrett Hobart, see, this is also the problem of being a vice president. Who the heck is Garrett Hobart? He served under President William McKinley, and he was such good friends with McKinley. They were named the McHobart, so they took both names, the McKinley and Hobart, the McHobart administration. That's super cool. It was back in the 1890s when VPs were often, 10 years later, when VPs, or 100 years later, 1890s, when VPs were often ignored. So the Hobart's close relationship was really unusual. And then Vice President John Nance Garner, who served under SVR, famously said the vice presidency wasn't worth a warm bucket of spit. I will let you guess what he might have said when he was not being polite. So there have been a lot of opinions. And the fact that I don't know who the heck John Nance Garner is, I'm going to guess that he led his vice presidency in a way that wasn't worth a warm bucket of spit. So this is cool. It hasn't all been friendship and awkward elections, though. Some presidents have found themselves in hot water and with scandals that have rocked the nation. And we're going to talk about Spiro Agnew. He was Nixon's vice president, serving from 1969 to 1973. So when I was a little kid. Agnew was known for his fiery rhetoric. He was a real big mouth. And he loved to attack the media and his political opponents. But behind the scenes, he was involved in some shady deals. And if you have listened to Rachel Maddow's podcast, Bagman, B-A-G-M-A-N, you're going to know this story. You know, Rachel is really a closeted historian. And so she loves going back and digging up these stories. And Bagman is a great story about how Agnew accepted bribes and kickbacks as vice president. And then the scandal broke wide open just right around the same time Nixon had to go. So, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but this wasn't just a small thing. This undermined public trust and contributed to the broader sense of government corruption that characterized the Nixon administration. And I'll tell you, Agnew wore his criminality with swagger. He just was not ashamed at all. So go listen to Bagman. It's really good. Anyway, that's about the vice presidency. We think we're going to get an announcement on Tuesday about who the Harris administration is going to tap for vice president. Tomorrow, let's take a look at vice presidents and what they've done to make a difference, because Many, especially now in the newer century, have been doing a lot of cool things that are really good work for the American people. So I will talk to you here, same place, same time, not the same time, tomorrow, about the vice presidency and what kind of differences they've made. Have a great weekend. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Make sure you subscribe and rate, and I'll be back with another episode really soon.